Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today's video is my November wrap-up, which is simultaneously my nonfiction November wrap-up. In the month of November, I managed to read 5 books, and they were all nonfiction, 4 of which were actually on my Nonfiction November TBR. I really enjoyed everything that I read this month, though, for various reasons. And I'm pretty pleased that I managed to read what I did, considering that this month has been insane. So why don't we just dive right in? So, the first book that I read this month is one that I actually started while I was on the line for early voting. Back in late October, I was online for three and a half hours, and this book kept me thoroughly entertained the entire time. And it is Quackery, A Brief History of the Worst Ways to Cure Everything by Lydia Kang, and it kind of does exactly what the subtitle says. It is basically a history of all the crazy ways that we've tried to cure what ails us over the course of human history, from ingestible cures, procedures, to devices. And the book just makes you really wonder, 1, how are people so gullible? And 2, how are people so stupid? I don't know how this book would read as text, because there are a lot of there's something very conversational, and there are a lot of witty asides that I feel like might actually be distracting in a physical book with text, but listening to it as an audiobook, it's just a wild ride. Man, some of these things that people have done over the course of history, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was just so bizarre. And I think it's definitely not a book for anyone who's squeamish. I have a love for medical history, which probably harkens back to the little Brittany who thought she was going to be a surgeon, but I love this type of thing, but it's definitely not for anyone who's squirmish, or squeamish rather, or is put off by blood, guts, scatological humor, that sort of thing, because it's all there, because we're talking about sickness, and we're talking about cures, and it's a messy business. If you do like medical history or science, I think this is just a really enjoyable book. It takes a topic that could be really dry and makes it really enjoyable. I hear a lot about Mary Roach and her humor, and so I kind of wonder if this is in the same vein as she writes many of her books. I haven't read anything of hers, but I'm kind of interested to compare, because this was really humorous and delightful, although it was talking about illness and how stupid humans are. But yeah, so I gave that book a 5-star, and as I said, I'd highly recommend listening to the audiobook for this one, because I do think it's quite an experience to listen to it. The next book was probably my most anticipated read for November, and that was The Tsarina's Lost Treasure, Catherine the Great, a Golden Age masterpiece and a legendary shipwreck by Gerald and Mara Vorhees. It's essentially the story of this triptych by Gerald, a Dutch master, that Catherine the Great purchases, that is unfortunately lost in a shipwreck while en route to her in Russia, and then centuries later, this search for the shipwreck in hopes of recovering the masterpiece and everything else that was lost. What I found particularly interesting about this was that it wasn't a straightforward narrative. There are actually 2 kind of storylines happening simultaneously in this book. And the first is really the story of this triptych by Gerald, and kind of its origins and its provenance. So you really start out learning who Gerald is, and he's one of Rembrandt's students who was very, very popular during his time period. You're learning about him as an artist, learning about this particular painting and how it's bought and sold several times before it ends up in Catherine the Great's possession. And you're also, in that same vein, learning about basically how Catherine the Great was acquiring all of these masterpieces, like so many of the royal families in Europe at the time. It was literally a pissing contest between all the monarchs trying to outbid each other for these masterpieces so they could have the grandest collections of art in the world. So the other storyline is much, much more contemporary. It's really dealing more so with trying to locate this missing shipwreck, finding the shipwreck, and then everything that happens in its aftermath, which there's a lot of kind of dispute over who actually has rights to the shipwreck, what is to be done with it. I have to say, you do really get a case of shipwreck fever. You kind of get that, like, taste of the action through this book as you're hearing what the divers are going through, as you're hearing about kind of all of the scientific and cultural and historical things that everyone is trying to accomplish. It was just really, really fascinating. I did give it 4 stars ultimately. There were a couple moments that they really lend themselves to that gross male gaze about Catherine the Great. There were just these 2 moments where it was really icky and turned me off slightly, talking about Catherine the Great putting it out for Potemkin, and I forget what the other one was, but I didn't like it. To be honest, it's probably unfair to take away an entire star for what is probably 2 sentences in this entire book, but they were really uncomfortable and unsettling for me, and they weren't necessary, and it just bugged me. So yeah, apart from that, I really enjoyed it. So, the next book is one that I read for the buzz prompt in Nonfiction November, and that is The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. Oh my god, the rage. The rage that this book made me feel is almost too difficult to put into words. It was a full-bodied rage, a blood-boiling rage, a rage that makes you stop reading at points because you want to punch a hole in the wall. That was the sort of response that I personally had to this book. And that's not to say that it's not well written, because it is. But just the things that happen and the fact that this is reality. It's essentially about these young women who work in a factory as dial painters, and they're the ones that are painting the numbers on the faces of these dials, but they're using a paint that has radium in it. But they are also being told to lip point their paintbrushes, which is to literally put the tips of these radium-laced paintbrushes in their mouth to create a fine point with the bristles and do the detail work, and it makes them sick. And the book is all about the deterioration of these young women's health, them trying to figure out what exactly is wrong with them, and then on top of actually reading about the physical deterioration of these young women, you have these corporations that are doing some of the sleaziest and most underhanded things in order to deny culpability for it. This book gives very Aaron Brockovich vibes. You do follow these court cases, these legal battles that some of these women are kind of leading in order to get compensation for all of the medical bills that are basically piling up because of how frequently they're in and out of doctors' offices getting treatments that aren't actually doing anything for them. You're rooting for them, these young women, the entire time. And every small victory is like a cause of celebration, but at the same time, it's also bittersweet because you know that at the end of the day, those victories aren't helping the women who are already sick. There's really there's no cure. There's no way to really make their pain and suffering more endurable. And it's just, it was so well written, but so heartbreaking. It really is a masterpiece, I would say. I definitely shed tears at certain points. I definitely wanted to punch holes in walls at others. It was definitely a 5-star read for me. I would just say, be prepared to hate big corporations after reading this, because there's really nothing redeemable about them in this book. So the next book is one that I read for the time prompt, and I interpreted time to be musical time, and I selected Violins of Hope, Violins of the Holocaust-Instruments of Hope and Liberation in Mankind's Darkest Hour by James A. Grymes. And when I picked this book up, I thought the title, Violins of Hope, was just a poetical title. What I didn't realize is that Violins of Hope is actually the name of a years-long project undertaken by this renowned Israeli violin maker named Eamon Weinstein, who essentially is finding violins with connections to the Holocaust and repairing them, restoring them, and basically collecting the stories of them in many cases. And so each of the chapters in this book is the story of one of these violins of hope. I think that one of the strengths of this book, apart from the fact that it is telling these stories of these violinists during the Holocaust, is that it is sharing stories that have not been told before. One of them is that the Israeli Philharmonic, which I actually listened to a concert of theirs on Zoom earlier in the summer, I didn't realize that it had been formed as the Palestine Orchestra, basically to bring musicians, Jewish musicians, who were being persecuted in Europe to Israel. One of the stories is about that and everything that was done to get these musicians to come to leave Europe to play in this orchestra. And then also didn't know about this amazing moment of protest in Norway when a bunch of music lovers at a concert actually attack these demonstrators who were kind of the equivalent of the Nazi youth in Norway for basically demonstrating against this Jewish musician who was supposed to be performing. And those are the sorts of stories that are being shared because of this commonality with music and the violin in particular and the importance of it. It was really, really interesting. It's also another book that is heartbreaking and definitely shed a few tears. It's not an easy subject, but I did really appreciate the way in which the stories were delivered. I appreciated the fact that it was told from such a different sort of angle or through a different lens than a lot of the other books on the Holocaust that I have read. I did give it 4 stars. When I picked up this book, I expected there to be a bit more information or exploration of why the violin in particular is so important within Jewish culture. And this book kind of just states that it's important and goes on from there. It doesn't explain why or how that actually came to be, and I think that might have been interesting to explore, at least in my opinion. I appreciated what this book was able to achieve, and if you are someone who loves music, who is interested in the Holocaust or Jewish culture, I would highly recommend it. It was a National Jewish Book Award winner, so it comes highly praised and recommended by not just me. So yeah. Finally, the book that I chose for the movement prompt of Nonfiction November is The Race to Save the Romanovs, The Truth Behind the Secret Plans to Rescue the Russian Imperial Family by Helen Rappaport. And if you've watched this channel for a little while, you probably know that I am enamored with Russian history. I studied it in school. I consider myself a Russianist to this day. So this was really up my alley as far as a book goes. I feel like most people know the story of the last Tsar of Russia, but this is really taking a look at what's going on in Europe at the time that they are imprisoned. And it really is, in a lot of ways, a political exploration. And the crazy thing is that thanks to the Grandmama of Europe, Queen Victoria, many of the European families had connections, familial connections to the imperial family in Russia. The two main ones that the book focuses on are George V of England and Wilhelm II of Germany, who are actually Tsar Nicholas's first cousins. It's looking at why these monarchs didn't do more, essentially, or why they just kind of remained indecisive throughout the whole thing. And it really comes down to what it seems like is all politics. They were worried about what interfering with this revolution against another monarchy might mean for the survival of their own monarchies in their countries, and whether it would cause some sort of revolution there. And they're also dealing with World War I at the same time. But you also have the monarchists in Russia who are still in full support of the Tsar and his family, except they never really get their act together. Like, they have a lot of pie in the sky sort of dreams, but they're not organized. And so because they're not organized, there's no way in hell that they would be able to logistically manage to get the Tsar and his family out of Siberia. So in the case of this book, I did end up giving it 3 stars. For me, Helen Rappaport in this was a little dry, and I didn't necessarily like the way that she would interrupt the narrative to kind of insert this behind-the-curtain look at her research process and what was going on as she's trying to locate these letters and reports and things in different archives. So, and there you have it. So yeah, that is the end of my November wrap-up. I really did enjoy all of these books this month, and it was so nice and refreshing to really focus on nonfiction for a change. I want to thank you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, please be sure to give it thumbs up, comment, and subscribe, and certainly let me know if you've read any of these books or if you're interested in reading any of them. I'd love to see you in the comment section. Thanks so much, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye!